Well, welcome back everyone to Mishnah in Depth, Sanhedrin and Makkot, where we have had the pleasure of learning the past few weeks with Rabbi Matthew Nitzanim. This class is part of our Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored by her family in her memory. We're really glad to be learning with Rabbi Nitzanim, who is also a teacher at Midrashet Amodim. With that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Nitzanim.
Again, thank you, Kayla, for getting us oriented, bringing us into our learning, and a pleasure to see everybody back for our fourth installment of our exploration of Masechet Sanhedrin. We have this shiur on Masechet Sanhedrin, and then next week also is Sanhedrin, and by the time we get to the week after that, we'll already be shifting our way into Masechet Makkot. So excited to have you all here with us. And our learning this past week was sort of a shift in many ways. Right in our opening weeks, shiurim 1, 2, and 3, or if we're counting in chapters say 1 through 6 of Masechet Sanhedrin, we're really getting us oriented to how the Beit Din, how the Sanhedrin operates, who can be a witness, who can be a dayan, a judge, how is testimony accepted, and so on. Then shifting towards the questions around procedure, particularly around capital cases where someone is at risk of, and in some cases does in fact go through execution. That sort of got us through the first 6 chapters. And as we moved into chapter 7, we sort of shifted to talking about what happens in the Beit Din to who gets punished and for what sins or crimes. What are the kinds of things that one might do that would earn them the punishment of execution? Right, we don't have to talk too much about the crimes of that relate to monetary disputes. That's mostly stealing, like taking other people's stuff or damaging other people's stuff, or even just debates about who is the real true owner of this stuff. Maybe there was even no crime done. Once we get to the cases that have to do with chiyuv mitzah, with execution, so now I have to figure out, well, what are the kinds of things for which one would be executed? Because we want to be sure that we're really clear on what those sins or crimes are before proceeding with a legal case leading possibly towards someone's execution. And so chapters 7, 8, 9, and I suppose we'll say 11, 10 is funny, we'll get to that in a moment. But a good chunk of the second half of the Masechet is really focused on what are the kinds of things for which one would be executed and in what way. As we mentioned in passing at the end of last shiur, there are four ways in which execution is executed, which execution is performed in halacha, which in many ways sort of stems from psukim from the Torah, and those are skila, stoning, srifa, burning, hereg, hereg, which is decapitation. That's the English word, and chenek, strangulation. So each of those is a method of execution. Each of them has some sort of reference in the Torah, some more, some less. And Chazal did this work of trying to figure out how do we match up crimes or sins with these forms of execution. And so that's really what fills these prakim. And so, and that's probably what you were mostly looking at this past week, primarily in chapter 7 and moving into chapter 8. All right, so I'm going to put some slides. Actually, before slides, curious to hear if anybody has thoughts, questions, comments, things that they noticed or picked up on in looking at the mishnayot this past week. If you have anything, great. If not, I have things I noticed. I'm happy to and excited even to discuss that with you, but I would love to hear if people have anything they want to share already off the cuff. So, okay, fantastic. All right, so then I'm going to pull up some slides, and there are a handful of things which I'm really excited to explore with you in the mishnayot that we covered this week. There are 3 sort of main topics I want to give some time to today. We'll see if we get all the way to the hour. Worst case, I'll give you a few extra minutes for learning, but I think we have a lot to unpack here. One is questions around the divine name and idolatry, meaning some of the rules around veneration of the divine name or divine names. Right, one of the sins for which one can be executed is cursing or otherwise denigrating the divine name, what we would call blaspheming, and also idolatry, worshiping idols. And I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between those two sins in the Mishnah as well as in the Torah. I want to talk a bit about loving thy neighbor. The Haftal Recha Kamocha is actually more present than we might have thought in our parak, if we just look for it carefully. And this will actually offer us an opportunity to think about how the principle of the Haftal Recha Kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself, which is seen as sort of a broad principle, maybe the broadest, most foundational principle in the Torah, says Rabbi Akiva, Ze Klal Gadol Torah, the foundation of all Torah. In rabbinic literature, it's only used a handful of times in actual halachic discourse, one of which is in our parak, so it'll be, I think, a productive lens. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the rebellious child, the Ben Soror Moreh. There's a lot to explore there, and hopefully you saw the opening psukim in the 8th chapter, Parak Ben Soror Moreh. So I want to talk a little bit about that child, what they're up to, what their story is about. So we'll take it from there. Okay, so those are our general themes. Let's start with divine name and idolatry. I wanted to just start by noting this pairing that appears in our mishnayot. Right, we saw in chapter 7 in, I think there's a typo, I think it's Zayin He and Zayin Vav. Mishnayot 5 and 6. They're not both in the same Mishnah. But side by side, we have in the Mishnah the case of the Megadif, one who blasphemes, who curses the name of God, alongside the Oved Avodah Zarah, one who worships idols, idolatry. A little further on, we'll discuss what exactly counts as idolatry. Nathan, I see you have a hand up. I'll get back to you in just a moment. Right, so there's some sort of, where these two cases are put side by side in the Mishnah. What's striking is that they also appear together in the Torah. If we were to open up not just any part of the Torah, but the Ten Commandments, we would see that that we start in chapter 20 of Sefer Shemot. In verse 3, we have Lo ta'aseh lecha pesach v'chol tmuna, right? Have no other gods and have no idols. And do not bow down to them, do not worship them, and so on. And immediately thereafter is Lo tisat shem Hashem k'chalashav, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. And so this pairing, this sort of acknowledgement of a relationship between idol worship and cursing God's name, is recognized not only in the Mishnah, but also in the Torah itself. In fact, that it may well be that the ordering here in the Mishnah is derived from the psukim in the Torah, this recognition of a relationship between these two things. Nathan.
Thank you. I am into piyutim, even though I do not, as often as I like, go to congregations that say piyutim, liturgical poetry. And around Shavuot, I like to read through the piyutim because there's a lot of time for Torah study. And one thing I've noticed, though, is so far I haven't seen any poet make a connection between Giduf, Hamegadef, and Lo Tisa. So I am happy to see the rabbi make this connection, but I'm wondering if they are exactly, if any other halachicists make the exact connection. And if so, perhaps it could be the first one to make, because it's Aleph, first commandment, Bet, second commandment, Gimel, third commandment. So an obvious connection would be to be like, Lo Tegadev, something, something, something.
I'll pause to say that when you use the term of the rabbi, I think you were talking about me, and you should feel free to just say you as we go ahead. You're right that it's not explicit, right? Meaning or I should say it this way. The Torah has a stated prohibition on cursing God. It appears in Parshat Emor, as I recall, in Sefer Vayikra. That's specifically about cursing the name of God, and taking God's name in vain is the Moneha mitzvot, right? Those who are in the business of trying to count up. How do we get to 613 mitzvot? Right, this is a popular medieval project, right? We know we have to get to 613. The Torah is an ambiguous book. How are we going to get there? And we have those all sorts of different counts. The Moneha mitzvot, broadly speaking, think of Lo Tisa, not taking God's name in vain, and V'nokev Shem Hashem Yumat. The cursing God is not necessarily the same, but at the very least related. One might be about swearing when using God's name, and one is cursing God's name. So it's somewhat unclear whether they are distinct mitzvot, or if in fact lo tisa and v'nokev shem Hashem are actually the same, right? That we would say this in rabbinic terminology. One is the prohibition itself, and one is the azhara, sort of the warning, meaning the statement of the punishment. So it's somewhat ambiguous, but even we'll say that lo tisa, the verse that appears in Shemot, not to swear falsely in God's name, and the prohibition on cursing God's name, even though they're distinct, the fact that we are connecting in both in the Mishnah and in the Torah the prohibition of worshiping idols alongside some acknowledgement of the veneration we have of the divine name, that it still strikes me as significant. Meaning, all the more so we're talking about the same prohibition, but even if we aren't, that pairing between idolatry and veneration of divine name, that still holds, and I think we're going to try to get at something. Okay. Now, I think what that may well derive from is even some verses from the Torah. In Sefer Devarim, when the Jews are given some instructions as to what is supposed to happen when they make it into the Promised Land, and they'll find the 7 nations, all these idolaters, and they are instructed, right? So go, when you get there, destroy all the places where all these nations have worshipped. Okay, I'm skipping to the next verse, which is about halfway through that second line. So destroy all the things they use in their worship. Destroy the altars, destroy the matzivot. It's a funny term, but some sort of like stone that's used as some sort of commemorative role in ritual. Their sacred ashirot are sacred trees, as best as we understand. All the idols, all the stuff they use for their idolatrous worship, destroy it, totally destroy it. And the verse closes, "V'ibadtem et shemam min hamakom hahu," and destroy their name from that place. The following verse is, "Lo tasun kin ladonai Elohechem," but don't do that for the Lord your God. Now, at face value, lo tasun kin, don't do that to the Lord your God, means don't destroy God's sacred places and altars and all the other stuff you use for ritual. In fact, the continuing verses in Sefer Devarim talk about the construction of what anachronistically we can call the Beit HaMikdash, meaning the construction of a place where the Jews are meant to congregate and bring their sacrifices and offerings, right? So some sort of sacred space for worship of God. So destroy the temples of the other gods, build one for your God, and presumably don't destroy it. But Chazal do a funny thing with this verse, Lo tasun kim Hashem Elokechem, don't do this to the Lord your God, as appears in Masechet Makkot. On the bottom of the screen, Hamochik et Hashem Elokeh, erasing God's name is a sin for which you can be receive the punishment of lashes. And the Gemara asks, V'az haratei mehacha, and the prohibition, the statement of the prohibition of the Torah appears here in this verse. V'ibadtem shemam, destroy the names of those deities, the foreign deities, and then lo tasun kim Hashem Elokechem, don't do this to the Lord your God. There's this funny thing that's happening where the Torah, the way that Chazal are reading these verses, it says destroy the idols of the other, deities. Don't do that to the Lord your God. Don't perform acts of destruction against the Lord your God. But what are the acts of destruction we're not meant to do? Destruction of the divine name, right? Erasing God's name. And in a sense, what we've done is we've replaced God's idols with God's name, right? The parallelism here is other deities have idols, destroy those. Our God has a name. Don't destroy that. Don't erase that. I want to say more about that in a moment, but Deborah.
I thought that this was the idea of Shemus, and Shemus can either be something physical, like if it's written, but it also extends to using God's name orally, and that's the connection here.
On a really, really technical level, the prohibition of saying God's name in vain and the prohibition on destroying like the writing of God's name, they're technically distinct prohibitions in the Torah, but there's seemingly no question that they're deeply related. And come from the same point, this sense that we venerate God's name. There's an academic who was asking around on social media. I won't say which one, so you'll all think you won't have to make presumptions of my age, but out there in the social media land, where this academic was working on an anthology, a forthcoming anthology on key themes in contemporary in Jewish theology. I was asking for ideas like, what are key topics that have to be addressed? And I responded, I really think that you can't get a good account of Jewish theology without thinking really carefully about Jewish veneration of the divine names. We care a lot about God's name in a way that is not entirely unique to the Jewish tradition, but it's pretty it's striking the degree to which and the ways in which we care about God's name. And in large part, it is probably because the rabbis constructed it in that way. And it may well be that the reason the rabbis are up to this is because God has no idols. Meaning, God has no physical manifestation. We're so into that, aren't we? Right? God doesn't have a body, and God can't even be represented by any sort of physical image. And so the closest thing that we can imagine that would be a physical representation of God is God's name. And because of that, we sort of treat God's name with the same kinds of respect that one might reasonably give to an idol, some sort of more physical representation of a deity. And I think it's for this reason that the prohibition on idol worship, even the obligation to destroy idols, and the respect for God's name, whether written or in speech, why these go hand in hand is because there's this recognition, maybe on the part of the Torah, certainly on the part of the rabbis, that the way they relate to God's name is the closest thing we can imagine to an idol. Right? We don't have idols. We don't have physical representations of God. We don't have like a little statuette that looks like God. What we have is God's name. And in order to give respect to God in a way that sort of makes sense to us, that's why we have to give great respect to God's name. It's sort of the placeholder that idols would be if only we had idols. I think that's part of what's happening here. Now, in that same vein, it's worth thinking about these questions around idolatry, right? If we looked at the Mishnah, chapter 7, Mishnah 6. Do I have this here? Yeah, here we go. The Mishnah about Avodah Zarah. I want to sort of take this moment to really look carefully about how the Mishnah imagines our relationship with what one's relationship with an idol might be, to maybe shed light on this question. The Mishnah reads as follows: Ha'oved avodah zarah. So one who worships idols, what do you have to do to count as an idolater such that you are subject to execution in accordance with rabbinic law? So that would be echad ha'oved, ve'echad ha'zovech, ve'echad ha'mekater, ve'echad ha'menasech, ve'echad ha'mishtachaveh, ve'echad ha'mekalo alav eleloah, va'omer lo eli atah. Okay, so there are 7 ways, if we counted right, that you can count as having transgressed the prohibition on idolatry. And those are oved, to worship, and worship is sort of a catch-all for the way in which the particular idol would be worshipped, or zovach, any sort of sacrificing, or similarly mekater or menasech, offering incense or a libation. Okay, so this all fits into the sacrificing department. Okay, so no worshiping the way that given idol is worshipped, and there's no offering sacrifices of any kind, and there's certainly no echad mishtachaveh, no bowing down, no prostrating, or mikablo alav leloah, or to accept it as your God, or to say to it, Eli atah, you are my God. Okay, so first of all, as the Gemara points out, the reason why we care about these forms of worship, about basically sacrificing and bowing, alongside however it is that deity is offered, is that we are coming with it a presumption: sacrificing and bowing, that's for all the gods. Okay, whatever your religion is, whatever your deity is, whatever you, sacrificing to something, I mean to a thing, and bowing to a thing, that is worshiping it. It's fine to imagine how maybe in the rabbinic mindset, yeah, just without a doubt, in all contexts, if you sacrifice or bow, that is worship. I wonder whether that's really true in our conception of religion, though maybe quite plausibly. I don't sacrifice or lie bait to anybody else. The bowing one, maybe we could question. What's really interesting, I think, is the end, right, where there are two cases: accepting the thing, the deity, I suppose, as your god, and saying to it, "You are my god." What's the difference between those two? What's the difference between mekablo alav le'eloah, accepting it as your god, and saying to it, "Iliata, you are my god"?
One is a thought process and one is action.
What do you mean by that? Can you spell that out?
One is an internal thinking, and the other one is you are bringing it into fruition and you are acting upon it. It's not just something that you've thought about, but you actually articulate it and say it and are willing to share it. You're not embarrassed or whatever. You might be able to say it publicly.
Amazing.
But as
First
a
of all, oh yeah.
As a consequence of that, in terms of Adim actually seeing somebody committing avodah zarah and being able to testify to it, there's an enormous difference between those two, because the internal one is something that they can't really bear witness to, as opposed to the articulation of "you are my God."
Okay, so I'm so glad that you brought this point to bear. Thank you to Deborah and to, I think that's Neil over there. This point is a really important one in anticipation of our learning for next week, and that's because next week we're going to, in this coming week's learning, you'll have the opportunity to learn the beginning of Perek Chelek, chapter 10 of Masechet Sanhedrin, which talks about it sort of digresses from talking about punishments in Beit Din, talks about who has a portion in the world to come, which is odd. Doesn't really fit in a Sanhedrin, but the argument goes that this too is a punishment that you can get for performing certain sins, and the question there is going to be: is there something happening there about sins which are uniquely categorized as the kinds of things that witnesses could never witness, and therefore we can't punish you in Beit Din? Therefore, God instead punishes you by taking away your portion of the world to come. There's some this question of what are there certain kinds of sins that, by their very character, witnesses will never be able to catch you on. Now, the tricky thing there is that a couple of those examples are things like ha'omer she'ein tchiyat hamitim min haTorah, one who claims there's no resurrection in the Torah. And here we're trying to suggest that ha'omer is the one that's more visible. Okay, we'll have to explore this in another week's time, but I just want to sort of put it out there that this question of when it comes to sins that have to do with beliefs, how to make sense of that, and in what ways are they what we might call I hope I'm using the word correctly, justiciable, meaning are they subject to treatment by the judicial system? That's a question to be mindful of in our learning up ahead. But to our point, what is the difference between these two cases, Mekablo and Omer? The Gemara claims in the Bavli that one is performed in the presence of the idol, and one is performed not in the presence of the idol. Ha'omer lo Eliata, to say to it, "You are my God," so evidently the idol is present. Which means that ha'mekablo alav lalo, accepting it is to accept it not in the presence of the idol, but presumably the idol is somewhere, you're just not there, but you're still talking about it. You said something out loud. Now, what's striking is that the Gemara presumes, and this is, I think, a reasonable reading of the Mishnah, is that we're talking about idols, right? As in, all these other things are presumably things you do to an idol, I guess. Though, certainly the one where you say, Eliata, you are my God. as opposed to mikablo alav laloa, which is the idol is not here, I'm just talking about it somewhere else. Which would cue us into presuming that the entirety of this first half of the Mishnah is talking about idols and not necessarily deities other than God. Meaning, I just want to spell out the point. There's a good question to be asked. What is wrong with idolatry? What's wrong with avodah zarah? What counts as avodah zarah? Is the problem to worship idols? Or is the problem to worship deities other than God, whether through the medium of an idol or not through the medium of an idol? Right? Let's say I want to worship Zeus. I don't have an idol of Zeus, but I just want to, worship Zeus. Does that count as avodah zarah? Not the physical representation of Zeus down here, or like in choose your temple in Athens. But here I'm in my house. I just want to call upon, the powers of Zeus up in the heavens. Is that avodah zarah? And it sounds from the Mishnah, we could read the Mishnah as saying that it is, right? If I worship Zeus, if I offer a libation to Zeus, all of that would be a problem. But the fact we have these two cases, accepting as a god and saying you are my god, that's redundant. And the Gemara presumes that the distinction between them is it here or is it not here? Meaning we're only talking about idols. And if that's the case about those two cases, accepting the divinity of the idol in its presence, and accepting the divinity of the idol not in its presence, it seems to suggest that all these acts of worship are only really prohibited, they're done towards an idol, but not necessarily if you worship some deity not through an idol. Now this is really spelled out in the second half of the Mishnah. Take a look. Aval, hamegapef, v'amenashek, v'amechabed, v'amarbitz, v'amarchitz, v'asach, v'amalbish, v'aman'il. If you do any of these things, you basically hugging, kissing, cleaning, washing, dressing, then you are over below ta'aseh. You have performed a prohibition, though you are not actually subject to the death penalty. Now, this tells us two interesting things. On the one hand, we are very clearly talking about idols, right? You can't wash off Zeus if we're talking about Zeus on Mount Olympus. You can clean off or wash off or dress or kiss or hug your idol of Zeus. That you could do. So again, it seems very clear that the Mishnah presumes that we're talking about idols. When we talk about the prohibition for which you can get killed, executed by the Beit Din, called avodah zarah, we're talking about the worship of idols, but not necessarily the worship of deities, not through the medium of idols. Now, at the same time, notice the opposite. Actually, just caring for idols, just, like cleaning them off and dressing them or whatever it is that one does with idols, that is only over below ta'aseh. It's a lower level transgression. The real transgressions are where you actually engage in some sort of worship or make some sort of theological claim, right? So there is some sense that there's more to it than just being there. The kinds of things that we could imagine doing even not to an idol, those are the more problematic acts, right? It's the ritual or the theology that gives us a hard time, where you really have transgressed the prohibition, even though it's only if there's an idol present. Before going to the next slide, I just want to note that the Tosefta has a slightly different version of our Mishnah, where it says that you are considered avodah zarah, an idolater, if you accept it as a god, say you are my god, or say Hatzileni, save me. I don't know what to make of that, but it's curious. It's curious that if you praying to a deity also counts as avodah zarah according to the Tosefta, but not according to the Mishnah. We can puzzle about that. Kayla, yeah.
I just want to bring up one question from chat that came up in the past few minutes from Sandra Lilienthal. Quote, saying, I'm assuming the name of a deity, does not mean I believe it. I may say it to appease, quote, the other.
Meaning, as in there, right, so to make use of the name of the deity, just saying, this is Zeus. How's Zeus doing today, right? That shouldn't count of its own right as idolatry. It seems to be only if you were to say to Zeus, you are my god, or at least in the Mishnah's version, only saying to an idol of Zeus, you are my god. But simply stating the name of the god wouldn't count as avodah zarah, seemingly. Yeah, Saul.
Isn't there another way to read that last phrase, that accepting God and saying that you're my God go together. That you have to do both or neither count.
Oh, interesting. And then what is the distinction between them? Like, what are those two elements?
Well, the two elements are personal or human. One is, as was mentioned, thought, and one is verbal. But in order to violate the law, you have to have both, because having only one, if you only have it in your mind, nobody knows, it's closed. And if you only say it, it may be under duress, or it may be. So I think there's a hint where all through that verse in the Mishnah, it has echad, but v'ha'omer eliata doesn't have echad. So I read that last phrase together.
That's really interesting what you're saying, Saul. I mean, my gut is to think that it doesn't have its own echad this, echad that, and then echad v'ha'omer lo eliata, only because they're just kind of two forms of the same thing, accepting as a god and saying you are my god. But I hear the claim they are making, which is maybe this is one act, accepting as a god and saying you are my god. I still, sort of drawing what we said before, the challenge would be that it could never have been that only thinking in your head that you accept it as a god would be a crime for which you could be executed, because we would have no way of knowing that you had committed that crime. And so it's true what you're saying, which is maybe it needs to be that both of those elements are present. But it's funny that it would have to be stated. But it's honestly, it's entirely possible. And thank you for bringing that. But the Gemara doesn't read the Mishnah that way. The Gemara reads it as two different cases, but it's not the only. I'm open to the possibility that the Gemara doesn't necessarily have the right reading of the Mishnah. And I like what you're saying, which is that maybe they really sort of go together. Yeah. Sandra.
Sorry, I'm outdoors. There's a lot of background noise. But what I meant is that I can say that I believe, or that this is my God, to appease a non-Jewish neighbor if I feel that, everybody comes to you and says, will you accept our God as your God? And you say, sure, which doesn't really mean anything. I just said it, and I might think that it's okay to say it. And the Mishnah comes to tell me it's not okay even to just say it. If you believe in it, of course, that's a real problem. But even if you don't believe it and just say it, it's still a problem. That's how I understand the difference.
Yeah, that would make sense, right? That to make a claim that whether or not you believe it, the very fact that you said it is already a form of idolatry, right? Same way that if you bow down to an idol and you don't think it's an idol, but you've still performed this act, that itself should be considered a form of idolatry. Yeah, for sure. In thinking about Avodah Zarah, I think part of what this Mishnah sort of raises and encourages us to think about is what is the character of Avodah Zarah, or of idolatry. Moshe Halbertal in his work, that's right, idolatry. It's an important work just trying to work out what is the biblical and rabbinic account of what idolatry is. Here's a passage from the introduction. The most frequently occurring term for idolatry in the Bible is the worship of other gods, while the rabbinic term, Avodah Zarah, which is generally translated as idolatry, idol worship, or false worship, literally means strange worship. The adjective in strange worship has two senses. One is the strangeness of the object toward which the worship is directed, not the proper God, but other gods. The other refers to the method of worship. These two concepts of strangeness, the strangeness of the ritual and the strangeness of the object of the ritual, constitute two pivots of our discussion. I couldn't bring the whole book, but what Halbertal tries to get at is that it's both in Tanakh and to some degree in rabbinic literature, there's this kind of puzzle that we're trying to work out, which is, what is the thing that we're worried about? Is it A, the worship of deities other than God? B, the worship of idols? Or maybe the both of them, and they hold related concerns or distinct concerns. But it's very easy to mix up our concerns about idolatry and our concerns for what we really should call polytheism, having multiple gods or believing in multiple gods. And pulling those apart is really important. And I think even using this as a snapshot for looking at that broader conversation, which there's a lot to unearth in Tanakh, in rabbinic literature, just think about our Mishnah, right? Where we have, it's not clear, like, is our concern some sort of theological belief about how many deities there are? Or is the real problem just about worshiping idols? But honestly, if you want to believe in some sort of deity or, wave it hello, but it wasn't in the form of an idol, that maybe it doesn't really count as avodah zarah. Maybe we don't like it, but it might not fall into that same category. So there's some ambiguity in this Mishnah. That ambiguity is actually tied into ambiguity that appears elsewhere in the sources we have available to us in Tanakh, rabbinic literature, about what is our holdup, idolatry or polytheism, or both. It's probably both. But even if we're going to say both, that idolatry and polytheism are both concerns, what is the relationship between them? And there are all sorts of halachic questions that come up, less so about the question of what about idolatry for God? We could suppose the Egel HaZahav, right, the golden calf, right, sort of the paradigmatic example of an idol that is for God, though interesting theological questions about thinking about the Beit HaMikdash, even thinking about the use of other sorts of objects that we use in our ritual life. At what point do those sort of lean into idolatry category? That's an area that gets less attention, comes up less. But really, the more pressing questions, thanks to the cultural world in which most of us live, is what about our relationship with other faiths that don't have idols, right? How do we think about the key cases are certainly Islam. Interesting questions about Christianity, depending on the denomination we're talking about. Questions also exist for Sikhs, Jains, Baha'i, and so on. How do we think about faiths where the account of the deity is not necessarily the same, but there are no idols? What is its status for the purposes of avodah zarah? Even before we get to the questions of what if they even believe in one deity like we do. But there's certainly much to unpack there. Yes, Abba, that's you.
Sorry, that seems to connect to what the verse and dvarim that you were bringing before, because as opposed to the interpretation that you were giving it, the lo taseh, referring to destroying or erasing God's name, a number of the Mefarshim actually interpret that phrase as being related to the method of ritual, namely, don't bring sacrifices to God on all these high places like they do. So in that sense, that seems to tie into what you're talking about now, about the distinctions between the method of ritual as opposed to who you're praying to.
For sure. It even seems what emerges from those psukim and dvarim. I don't have them all on the slide, so I can't pull them up. But after it says destroy all those other, all those temples out there, don't do that to God. It then says make sure to build a temple when you get to the land of Israel. It's one place you'll bring all of your sacrifices to Hashem. And so it sounds like that's what we're saying. It's just it's about they have their temples and we have our temple. And it's Chazal who turn it into, actually, there's something here about God's name, this other form of representation of God. And if we really want to do careful work, and this is part of what Halbertal does in the book, is try to pull apart what is Tanakh's approach to this question of idolatry and polytheism and how they relate or are distinct from one another, and then how do Chazal think about these questions, and in many ways they're different. And that sort of is reflected, as you're pointing out, in what seems like the pshat of those psukim about don't do that to God, and it means make sure to have a temple for God, versus Chazal, don't erase or destroy God's name. There's these different versions of what it means to respect the representation of God. Okay, so with that, I want to pivot for a moment, pivot at this point to loving our fellows. Traditionally, we call this something like the golden rule, the golden principle, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It seems pretty broad, right? Just kind of something like be nice, a good rule to have. The broader sort of meaning of Avtal Recha Kamocha, of be kind to others, is already reflected in early rabbinic literature, in the statement from Rabbi Akiva. It's a hit single from Miami Boys Choir, as I recall. Right, Avtal Recha Kamocha, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva teaches Ze Klal Gadol BaTorah. This is a great principle in the Torah. Or as the Sfat Emet in the Hasidic reading reads, Ze Kalal. This is that which encapsulates all the Torah. It holds us together, and hence it holds the Torah together. So this is sort of the foundation of Torah. The Rambam really takes this to its to the next step in Hilchot Evel, of all places, in the laws of grieving, where he writes as follows: Mitzvah aseh shel divreihem. It is a mitzvah aseh, an obligation, midivreihem, right, of deriving from the authority of the rabbis, right? So it's d'Rabbanan rather than d'Oraita, to do the following: levaker cholim, lenachem avelim, losi amet, lachnis kala, lelavot ha'orechim, litasek bechol tzorcha kibura, lasit al hakatef, elech lefanav lispalach, velachpor velikpor, vechel lesamech hakala vechatan. I'm stopping there. We have to do all these things: visit the sick, comfort the mourners, care for the deceased, take care of wedding prep, accompany guests, and so on. Skipping to the end of the third line, and these are forms, expressions of gemilut chasadim, of expressions of kindness that we do with our bodies, right, in action, rather than gemilut chasadim shebemamuno, as it described in the Gemara, kindness by way of our money. That's like tzedakah, but these are acts of kindness that we do that have no limit, neither minimum nor maximum. Right, so there are also things we do, and the Rambam is mentioning it here in Hilchot Evel, the laws of grieving, because he thinks that the fundamental source of all of our obligations towards taking care of the deceased and taking care of the mourners stems from this place of gemilut chasadim, of being kind. And then he says, Afal pisha kol mitzvot elu midivreihem, even though these are all only rabbinic obligations, hareihin bichlal ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. I'm on the last wide line. These all really derive from V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Kol hadvarim she'ata rotzeh she'asu otam lecha acherim, aseh otam lechich b'torah v'mitzvot. The same, that which you would want others to do for you, you ought to do for others. Now, already from the outset, it's worth pointing out I think the traditional account of do unto others as you would have them do unto you is to read it as really a prohibition, right? And this is how it appears in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, and the story of Hillel and the guy who asked to be taught the whole Torah 1 foot, where it's don't do unto others as you would have them not do unto you, right? As in it's telling us about what not to do to one another, right? If you wouldn't want someone to do something to you, don't do it to them. The Rambam wants to claim that it's actually goes a step further, where anything which you would want people to do for you, you should do for them, right? It's an active obligation to do all these things, right? So for the Rambam, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself, has real halachic currency. It's telling us a thing which we are meant to do, right? All our acts of kindness derive from there. The reason I wanted to bring this Rambam is not only because it's an important one, it's good to be reminded to engage in acts of kindness whenever we can, but because it's a real contrast to Chazal. In rabbinic literature, right, in the Mishnah and the Gemara, there is almost no reference to V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself, in any halachic context. Right? There's almost no discussion of what is the actual way in which we fulfill the obligation to love your neighbor as yourself, the way the Rambam offers us here. Rambam's going to say, anytime you do any act of kindness, you are fulfilling this mitzvah stated in the Torah. Chazal seem to have forgotten to talk about V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And there are really only 2 appearances of this principle, love your neighbor as yourself, in the Gemara, one of which appears in our parak, in the Gemara. So the quotation is from Daf Mem Hey, which is actually a little bit earlier than our parak, but it's talking about a ruling that appears in the Mishnah. In our prakim from the 7th chapter. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Bar Avua. So this teaching of the name of Rav Nachman actually appears, I think, 4 or 5 times throughout the Talmud. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Ve'avta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. Biror lo mita yafa. Make sure to determine for him a mita, a death, which is yafa. Good, nice. Let's say nice. A nice death. And what we're talking about here is rules of execution. And so it doesn't mean a nice death, but actually a nice form of execution. When executing, find a nice way to do it. Okay, what Rav Nachman is talking about is what we saw, what you would have seen in the 7th parak, at the beginning of the 7th chapter in the Mishnayot, where it describes the manner in which execution is performed. Now, these details about how exactly the various forms of execution, skila, srifa, and so on, are meant to be performed. And Rav Nachman claims that the reason why the Mishnah specifies that these forms of execution should be performed in exactly the way that they are spelled out in the Mishnah is because we're trying to do perform the execution in as nice a way as we can. Beror lo mitayafa. It is a fulfillment of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Okay, already off the bat, that's weird, right? The only v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha we could think of was when you execute, try to do it nicely. It's not the most loving thing we can do. I want to bring one more, and then I want to hear some thoughts about what these are about. The second appearance of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in a halachic context in the Gemara is as follows: appears in Masechet Kiddushin, Asur le'adam she'kadish et ha'isha ad shi'irena, that a man and woman are not allowed to be married to one another until they have seen one another. Or at least in the traditional formulation, the man has to be able to see the woman. Shema yir'eh ba'davar meguneh v'titganeh alav, because maybe if he sees her, he'll notice something which is unappealing or unattractive about her, and she won't find favor in his eyes. But God says, the Torah says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so there are 2 cases of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in the Torah. In the Talmud. 1, find a nice form of execution. 2, make sure to see your prospective partner before marrying them. What gives? Why are these the 2 expressions, manifestations of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha that the rabbinic tradition could think of? And is there any sort of relationship between them?
So far, nothing in chat, but people are welcome to speak up.
I don't have I don't have a theme for both of them, but the way that I've thought about the first one in the past is that like this is someone who like literally was judged in court and is deserving of death. And so you might think we can throw this like you know like he's not my Reacha anymore. He's not like you know like who like this is someone who again like clearly you know deserves death. And so I might think that like I don't need to worry about this kind of stuff anymore. But even in like this extreme case, there still isn't an element of like you know you need to like make it a good death, not overly painful, not overly embarrassing or shaming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew is already getting us ready for Masechet Makkot. In Masechet Makkot, we're going to learn about when the Beit Din would administer lashes for certain crimes. And the rule is that, as stated in the Gemara, that once a person has gotten lashes, they regain their full status as a member of the Jewish community, right? Because it says "V'nikla achicha le'inecha," that that's the verse in the Torah, that your brother shall be nikla, denigrated, I suppose, before you. And it says the Gemara, once they have been denigrated, have achicha. Once they can become your brother. Meaning, even in a moment when someone is being punished in the court, we can't take away from them their dignity, right? Their status as one of us. That holds true even at that most trying moment of punishment, and in this case, even at the moment of execution. Yeah, absolutely, right? There are all sorts of rules, and some of this came out in the Mishnah, which you might have seen, and it's further discussed in the Gemara for those of you who will take the time to learn the Gemara on these mishnayot, or you're following along Daf Yomi, we'll get there in another few weeks, where there are these rules to ensure that the dignity of the person being executed is maintained. Questions about whether they can stay dressed, how they stand, even some of the issues around whatever. Without getting into too much detail, this is a concern of ours: maintain the dignity of the person who's subject to execution. Any other thoughts on this? These two things.
Just from chat, to quote from Rebecca Austin, even this horrible person is made in the image of God, and bracket, and the bride shouldn't put up with that shallow groom, bracket.
Yeah, so the image of God is really important. It's a good question whether when we talk about a nice execution, do we mean that which is comfortable, so to speak? Right? Are we talking about minimizing pain? Or, in accordance with what we discussed, I think last week about Tselem Elohim in the rabbinic conception thereof, we're actually talking about something more like bodily integrity, right? Respect. Is this about respect of the person, respect of their body, because their body is a representation of the divine? But either way, yeah, the dignity of the person remains even in this moment. And I think the case about the marriage is also relevant in the same way, which is we're talking about people who are at their most vulnerable. Right? People who are, where we're not talking about going and doing acts of kindness, that's how we, love one another. But how can we ensure that when we're dealing with people who are entirely vulnerable to the whims of others, right? You're undergoing execution, there's nothing you can do to stop it. Or even the case of marriage, where we're talking about, again, the way that it's sort of framed in the Talmud, where this woman it's not really up to her exactly what's going to happen in this marriage. It seems to be somewhat arranged. And we don't want to put her in this sort of position of vulnerability where she's stuck into this marriage and then it all falls apart. And so there's something here about vulnerability, I think. It's not only about thinking the abstract of what might a person need, but where are there moments when people are really subject to the whims of others, and how in that moment can we be sure that we are respecting their needs, respecting their dignity. That may be something that holds the two of them together. It may be that there's no real sort of genuine connection between them, but I wonder whether we can at least glean that sort of similarity between these two cases. I want to address one other point that came up from our mishnayot over the past week, and that's the Ben Soror Moreh. I just want to open up one sort of piece of that puzzle in the time that we have left. The Ben Soror Moreh is a really unusual case, right? Already the way in which it's formulated in the Torah and the Sefer Devarim, or we have this child who is wayward and rebellious, who, at least as the Mishnah imagines it, they eat a little bit they're not supposed to, they take some things from their parents, and look at that, they get executed. It's kind of wild. It's really kind of wild. It's a good question where it comes from. And Ben Soror Moreh is, in academic reading of Talmud, is seen that this chapter of the Gemara is seen as like a clear example of when the rabbis are troubled by something and find all sorts of ways to basically legislate it out of existence. Right? It seems like in the Torah, Ben Soror Moreh, you have a kid, seems to not be behaving so nicely, and parents say, yeah, we don't like him, let's kill him. And come the rabbis and say, well, or if you follow the Mishnayot carefully, right, which you would have seen in the opening of the chapter 8, well, it's only if the child is between the ages of 13 and I think 3 months. And only there's like questions about like, puberty status, and if either parent is deaf or blind or missing a limb, then it doesn't count. And it's only if they take a certain amount of meat and a certain amount of wine from their parents, but not entire, but they told their parents, but then they didn't ask their parents. If you go through these rules in the Mishnah, it becomes clear that it's almost impossible for there ever to be a Ben Soror Moreh. Now, the Mishnah doesn't say, we're going to make sure this never happens. It just tells us the rules, but it makes those rules so limited, so constraining, that it could basically never happen. And this is reflective of what some will claim is that this happens in a number of places in rabbinic writing, but it's especially clear in the case of Ben Soror Moreh, where the rabbis are uncomfortable with it, and so they put in all these little rules that effectively make it disappear, right? They don't actually say, we have removed Ben Surah Moreh from the Torah. They just functionally do that by making it almost impossible to accomplish. Now, along those lines, I just want to share one idea about the Ben Surah Moreh, which appears in the writing of Rav Soloveitchik, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. It appears in the book Vision and Leadership, which is a collection of essays which is published posthumously, where it makes the following argument. There's a line that you may have seen if you did Sunday's mishnayot, right? Today's mishnayot, already today. On the right side, on the left side of the screen, sorry. Ben Surah Moreh nidon Hashem sofo. One of the fun things about the Ben Surah Moreh, about this child, is that the child is judged based on what they are going to do in the future. Right? It's not that the child has done something that is actually worthy of execution. They stole some food from their parents. That's not a sufficiently problematic crime. Rather, they are judged based on what we anticipate they're going to do now that they've already demonstrated this tendency towards theft. I've heard it argued that it may well be that in the shot of the Torah, we're actually imagining a world in which people live with limited resources. Food is scarce. And if you are a child who starts stealing your parents' collection of food, you are actually putting your family at risk. Maybe there's something really there that actually is worthy of execution. But the way that the Mishnah reads it is, the child is being judged for what we think they're going to do in light of what we've seen them do already. Again, unusual, right? We don't usually say that. The Mishnah has to state that because generally we only judge people in the Beit Din based on what they have actually done, not what we're fearful of what they'll do in the future. Now, there's another peculiar line about Ben Surah Moreh. This one appears in the Gemara, maybe more familiar, where the Gemara says, Ben Surah Moreh lo haya velo atid lihiyot. The case of Ben Surah Moreh has actually never happened and never will. A bold claim. Even though this case appears in the Torah, it never happened, it's never going to happen, to which the question is asked, V'lama nichtam. So then why is it written in the Torah altogether? Derosh v'kabel sachar. The reason why the case of Ben Surah Moreh is written in the Torah is just for us to study it and reap the benefits of having studied this piece of Torah. Right? The Gemara is even acknowledging that we basically think this case never happened, and the rabbis helped that happen by so constraining the rules. And we say it's only for the sake of learning. These are these two sort of pieces of the story of Ben Surah Moreh, which make the case unusual. The fact that the child is being judged for what will be in the future, and the fact that this is all theoretical. Rav Soloveitchik makes this interesting claim, which is just something for us to think about, which is that these two unique elements of the Ben Surah Moreh actually go hand in hand. Right? Says Rav Soloveitchik, sure, the case of Ben Surah Moreh is given to us so that we can learn something from it, something theoretical. Well, what is that thing we're supposed to learn? Says Rav Soloveitchik, the thing we're meant to learn is that the Ben Surah Moreh nidon Hashem sofo. The Ben Surah Moreh is judged for what they will do in the future. And he explains as follows. Throughout Masechet Sanhedrin, it's clear that in a human court, we can only judge that which we can see, and that which we know, that which witnesses can testify to. That's how we judge. But God wants us to know that, in principle, God is capable of judging even about that which we will do in the future. Right? God is not limited to only how we are in the present. And so God gave us this piece of Torah, the Ben Surah Moreh, to teach us a theoretical concept. What is that theoretical concept? That it is fair, in theory, to judge people for what they will be in the future, if only you could know that with certainty. God can know that, we can't. And so what Ben Surah Moreh is really coming to teach us is the theoretical possibility of judging people based on the future, if only we would know. But reminding us, we don't know the future. We're incapable of knowing, and therefore, we don't have a case of Ben Surah Moreh. We can only judge about the present. We can only judge about that which we can see. It's a clever way of putting these two pieces of the Ben Surah Moreh story together, and offers us, I think, an important idea how we think about Masechet Sanhedrin more broadly in jurisprudence. What are the limits of that which we are capable of judging? And how do we, within our systems of judgment, focus on that which we are capable of understanding and seeing and knowing, rather than falsely making presumptions of that which we can't see or can't know or can't predict? I see we're at the hour, so We'll have to pause here. I just want to briefly mention that which we have coming up next week in shiur number 5 for Sanhedrin. We'll be looking at as they're going through the end of chapter 8, all of chapter 9, and some of chapter 10. The concepts we'll be looking at are questions around self-defense, as well as the definition of manslaughter, meaning how do we govern rules around killing of one another, and justified self-defense, and so on. Some important moral questions. And the world to come, we're going to get into, as we mentioned, Perek Chilek, this Perek of the Mishnah that talks about the world to come, how we get there, how we get disqualified from there. So we'll be exploring some of that together. I just please a reminder that in your learning, be mindful of the fact that some editions of the Mishnah put what's called Perek Chilek, the chapter about the world to come, as chapter 10, and others put it as chapter 11. There's a question about the order of the prakim. Our game plan is to treat it as chapter 10. That's how it's usually published in the Mishnah, but just be mindful of that. We're looking for, when you get to chapter 10, you want it to be about the world to come.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the content note. And I hope to see as many people as possible next week for more learning. And I just want to let people know that our spring Zman classes are open for registration at drisha.org/classes, including the next class in this Mishnah in-depth sequence on Shavuot, starting after this, and you can sign up for that and other classes online. With that, happy learning. Best of luck with the next week's mishnayot.